Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfirth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Good morning, Curtinistas. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast, hosted by myself, Nick Dyrenfirth, head honcho of the John Curtin Research Centre. I'm joined once again by my good mate, Kung Fu Cos Samaras, head honcho of Redbridge Group. We're kicking goals left, right and centre. How are you, Cosy?
Good.
You enjoying the Festival of Democracy and the Labor Party over the weekend?
You were?
I certainly wasn't. I certainly wasn't, Cos. But that's politics. That's politics.
You're about to confuse many of our listeners as to what you're about to talk about. Internal Labor mechanics or Green mechanics or Liberal Party mechanics is almost like a foreign language to a lot of people.
Oh, it is. It is. You know, we might as well be living on a different planet. It's not what most people get up to on Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon.
Correct.
And they're probably watching Netflix, which is the theme of today's episode, Cos. Riffing off, I thought, was a wonderful piece in the New Statesman. New Statesman is the leading left-leaning magazine of, I guess we could say, the British centre-left. There was a great article by George Eaton, who's the political editor, and he talks about the rise of Netflix politics and an ungainly phrase, the Netflixisation of politics, with a particular bent towards what's going on in the UK. Keir Starmer's government is under tremendous pressure, and so are the Tories, both polling abysmal numbers and under assault from, in the main part, Reform on the populist right, but there's also now
Greens.
A surge in the Greens, who have a new leader, a self-styled Green populist, Jack Palahniuk, who, like Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform, is operating with the pace and energy of a tornado. And in addition, you've got your party, which has had some teething problems, but this is a kind of the rump at the far left of the UK Labor Party, Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana, who have left and started up a new, populist left political party. So Starmer is under pressure from the left and the right. So are the Tories from the right. And what this means, if we look more broadly in terms of the politics of the West, the democratic world, is that we are seeing the fragmentation of voter loyalty. So once upon a time, people digested legacy media, where it's a 6 p.m. news, where they got their snippets of information and politics. They read newspapers. They had an offering from the centre-left, the British Labour Party in the UK, ALP in Australia, the Coalition, and back to the UK, the Tory party. Now, that's been upended over the past few decades, particularly since the GFC in 2009 onwards. And we're going to talk about what that means for Australian politics. This is something we've talked about in detail on previous episodes. George Eaton's thesis is the UK's fractured political landscape is being driven by psychological shifts, and you're going to talk in depth about those psychological shifts, and they're driving similar trends here. So voters used to digest that legacy media, TV, print, radio, but they now, in his words, stream their politics like entertainment, like Netflix. What this means is the traditional loyalties. Another way of putting it, because we were talking off air about this, people used to, drink Coke or Pepsis. There are now other new and exciting brands of politics out there which are eating into those familiar political brands. And it's intersecting with new generational fault lines, geographic fault lines, and it's reshaping electoral behaviour.
It's actually been in place now for some time. I mean, if we look at what's going on in the UK, it's effectively what's been going on in this country for, I would say, the turn of this century. So back in 2001, at the federal election, the other vote, the minor party vote in Australia, was around 14%. At that time, a third of the electoral roll was made up of the great generation, silent generation. A significant, larger group was made up of baby boomers. Gen X made up, probably 28 to 25% of the electoral roll. There was only about 2 or 3% of millennials on the electoral roll. That was at the time. The oldest millennials today were 18, 19 years of age back then. Again, we've discussed this, and we are talking about a group of Australians and a group of voters, be it in this country or in the UK or in the US, largely older, largely who grew up or who had access to forms of news entertainment which was very, very structured. But at the same time, they also were living through a unique economic time in human history where prosperity was extremely high. And so we saw obviously these generations vote for the major parties in very big ways. Since then, we've seen the fragmentation. It's largely been driven by younger voters in this country, just like in the UK and everywhere else. In this country, they've gone from voting for the two major parties to as more and more millennials were enrolling to vote, more Gen Z enrolling to vote. They've obviously are choosing the parties in this country of the left. And as we've touched on, Nick, in our previous episode, that particularly amongst Gen Z, the Green vote is in excess of 30%. What we're seeing in the UK is really the same trend. Labor is largely losing votes to the Greens and to a lesser extent to Reform, but largely to the Greens. And the Conservatives obviously are losing significant ground to Reform. And that is that trend of major political parties now losing votes to minor parties to their flanks. And that's what's happened here in this country since the August 31st immigration rallies. Nothing that has occurred in the polling numbers since then has surprised me. What we have seen is a doubling of the One Nation vote, and it's largely come at the expense of the coalition.
Just to come back a bit, Cozzy, you talk about 2001, which when millennials are voting for the first time. I'm having a look at the 2007 election, and the major parties between them have won 85%
That's right.
of the primary vote. 85%. Your latest poll, Redbridge AFR poll, had it at 64, 65% combined.
Yeah.
And the other vote is obviously, it's about 14, 15%. The Greens are only at 7.8% here. One Nation aren't even on the map.
Yep.
You've got Family First, you've got the Christian Democrats, but between them, less than 3%. The Democrats are still holding on there with 0.7%. But it's very interesting. At the next election, 2010, and as I mentioned before, in between those two elections, you've got the global financial crisis, which smashes young people, and it's there as I can see just looking at the major party combined votes is 73%. So it's dropping off big time by 10% in one election.
And that trend continues.
And that's where you see the Greens spike for the first time up to 13%.
That's right. But we see that trend now continue in very significant numbers. 70% of the other vote in this country now, which is about 33% on election day, is made up of millennial and Gen Z. The other thing that we do know, and going back to your initial point around the sort of tribalism and fragmentation of party politics, is that we see more of a trend where if, for example, Labor loses support, it loses support to minor parties and mainly to minor parties of the left. So in Victoria, in the state of Victoria, Labor's primary is in the low 32% mark. What we know is most of the vote they've lost since the last state election is sitting in the departure lounge amongst other parties. A bit in the Greens, but a bit everywhere else. It's a very transient, I would say, non-fixated group of voters, right? But they will not vote for One Nation, for example. So this notion that you're going to start pinching votes off your ideological opponent, which used to occur with baby boomers a lot and the silent generation to a lesser extent, we just don't see that trend now occurring with millennials and Gen Z. Millennials and Gen Z are more prone to be to basically what we call psychological sorting. So if you're a left-wing voter, you stay a left-wing voter. You may indeed vote for Labor, or you switch around and you vote for the Greens or another minor party. It's highly unlikely that you're going to start voting for the right on issues that relate to issues that trigger right-wing conservatism, like immigration, law and order.
Yeah,
those issues will trigger a particular response from right-wing voters. I think you and I talked about how that has impacted the coalition as a result of the immigration debate in this country. So I think that at the next election, if Labor was to lose more votes, it will lose it to its left flank. That's, I think, the trend we're seeing. We're seeing that in the UK right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the flip side there, in terms of that cohort of left-leaning voters, that growing cohorts, because they're not attracted to an anti-immigration, law and order
That's right.
agenda. And the other reason they're not attracted to centre-right politics in that context is because the centre-right have nothing to say on economics and housing.
Yeah, that's right. There's a bit of that. But there's also, we know that it's just that there's something about younger voters now in Western democracies is very different to older voters. They are much more driven by very deep-rooted psychological predispositions. And it's very hard to see how they will shift that mindset. So if they're voting for the parties of the left, they will continue to do so. They're unlikely to find a pitch from conservatives as the solution. So, for example, when we speak to younger millennials and Gen Z about immigration, some of them might tell us they've got concerns about it, but they're not voting on it. When we speak
to very important distinction, right. Very important distinction.
Huge, that's right. Law and order. Yeah, they might say there's a problem with law and order in Victoria, for example, or in other states, but their response to it is, yeah, but it's a problem of society, fragmenting society, social disorder, government's not stepping in to help, struggling families, youth crime is a product of a societal breakdown. That's a very different response to when we talk to conservatives, whose response will be, well, you're just not tough enough. So it's a very authoritarian, paternal response to law and order as an issue. And this is where I think a lot of the Labor camp, particularly in Victoria right now, you see some of that backgrounding going on, where they completely misread their own electorate. If you're going to respond to a law and order campaign with a mallet, which is, a ham-fisted approach, we're going to get tougher on young people, we're going to throw away the key, they're going to punish you for that. And they'll vote for the Greens and they'll vote for minor parties. And that's how that fragmentation occurs. But if you respond and say, yep, it's a problem, we agree, but we're not only going to do something in the sentencing space, but we're going to actually address it more holistically and address some of the societal undercurrents which are concerning you, then you might find voters might say, well, that's a fair enough response. So the danger I think the Labor camp has in this country, both at a federal and state level, be it state level on law and order and federal immigration, is if their response to it is to use right-wing solutions, they lose votes to their flanks. It's what's happened with Keir Starmer in the UK. When they came into government, they implemented a number of austerity measures which upset their left flank. Hence, the Greens are growing exponentially in the UK. They have lost some votes to reform amongst older Labor voters outside of London, in regional areas. But we're not seeing that here in this country. So, again, it's becoming a lot more complicated. And I would say those who are running campaigns for the major parties now, be it in this country or in the UK or anywhere else, got their hands full. It's a very complicated, psychologically, it's a psychological stew, so to speak.
And over the weekend, there was a dramatic example of that, Cozzy. There was a Welsh by-election.
Yes.
Labor Heartland Territory used to be a former coal-producing region. We know the coal mines have been shut down, and that's caused huge economic dislocation. Yet Labor voters stuck fat, and they, I think the Labor primary vote, this is of course the first past the post system, high 40s. Mm-hmm. On the weekend, it collapsed to 11%. 11%. Reform surged. I think they won sort of 36, 37%, but you had the Welsh Nationalist Party, which is left-leaning. They won the seat.
Yes.
With a vote in the high 40s.
There's your left-wing alternative.
Correct.
Okay. And we will see a lot more of that going forward, right? Where when Labor gets itself into trouble in this country, for example, it will find itself up against the Greens and other alternatives from the left side of politics. We're going to see less and less contests, genuine contests of, I'll say, significant geographic territory between the Liberals and Labor. And actually, my point about what we're seeing here at the moment with One Nation growing at the expense of the coalition, that could hold or it might not. My point there is a lot of frustration at the moment being expressed by the more right-wing elements of the coalition's voter base, but that could come back to them, right? Mm. The catch-22 situation they find themselves in, though, is if they try to appeal to their right flank by being more hardline on immigration, they'll lose that moderate wing that they rely on just to have some presence in big urban Australia. Hence, because we're such a different country to the UK, the big cities matter here, and they are a lot more diverse. And just on that, we're now picking up in our research very significant anxiety within diverse Australians. It's the highest I've seen it. It's this
cultural anxiety, economic anxiety, or both?
Anxiety about being basically picked on. Mm. Basically being having a circle, written around you, and that you're the problem. I would say there's going to be a political repercussion for that. I'm not sure what that's going to look like, but it's not going to be good for you on the Conservative side of politics.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how that plays in Victoria, because Victoria obviously goes to the polls before the next federal election. Yes. Just coming back to, we've spoken about some of the psychological basis of what's going on. Yeah. I think the material basis is super important, absolutely super important. I want to come back to this theme of the Netflixisation of politics and how both major parties, but mainly the centre-right, are struggling to deal with this the rise of Netflix politics, breakdown of mass audiences, the rise of niche tribes, and the consumption of digital media. I'm interested in you responding to this idea that, politics has become almost a form of algorithmic entertainment. So voters are more subscribers, not loyalists.
There is still a very strong undercurrent driving that behaviour. So if you've got authoritarian traits in your personality makeup, in other words, you're attracted to that type of tribalism, you're going to be basically animated more by strongman politics. You're going to be more likely voting for the parties of the right. If you're the opposite to that, then you're going to obviously be gravitating towards the parties of the left.
Yep.
But yes, depending on your psychological makeup and how you grew up and the community you've grown up in, and we've got to emphasise for a lot of Australians now, their community is not based on where they live. It's borderless. It's international. You're no longer relying on a pen pal to communicate with someone from overseas. And for those of you who are old enough,
did you have a pen pal growing
absolutely
up?
not. No, hell no.
I didn't do that in Broady.
That in Broady, mate. But it still took 3 months to get a new album out there from one of the bands I used to follow. Right, that's how slow things were. Right, but today it's instant, it's borderless, it's international, and you can have just as much in common with a young person living in Sweden than someone living in Orange in Australia. As in, you'll have a lot more commonality and political alignment with someone in that country versus someone that's just up the road. Right? And I think that's what's going on. And it actually goes to your point, Nick, and that is that fragmentation, it has occurred, but there's now strong, I would say, siloed trends where we see people basically picking a side. And I would say then once they've picked a side, they pick what sort they like. Goes to your point, right? Which is, you can vote for the parties left, but it doesn't mean you'll be voting for just one all the time.
No, that's the key thing. So we're seeing both major parties are bleeding to their flanks, but at present it's the coalition.
That's right.
Who are not just bleeding, they're hemorrhaging.
They're hemorrhaging to one nation. But again, I'll put a really strong blanket of caution over that, because I think that when election comes around again next time, we might see two things occur. One, the coalition voters feel that the only way they can actually get some change for them and their view of the world is to vote for the coalition.
Yeah, I want to dig deep. There's been a lot of commentary about the surge in One Nation. You picked it up in your polling.
Yes.
I think we should be really careful with interpreting that surge, because I've said it before.
They're frustrated. They've lost an election. There's immigration's a hot topic for them being the Conservative voters. They're really angry that the world that they thought they lived in doesn't actually exist. And so they're frustrated. They're parking their vote on One Nation.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's permanent.
We've seen this surge before. In fact, I wrote something in 2016 for the Monthly about Hans, because she was surging in 2016.
Yes, correct.
After the election.
That's right.
It didn't translate into electoral success because there's a ceiling on the One Nation vote. There's a ceiling for a couple of reasons. One, and they're related. They're intertwined. One is Pauline Hanson herself. She began as an anti-establishment politician. She's now been in politics for nearly 3 decades. She cannot plausibly claim to be anti-establishment. She will not talk about people's economic anxieties without referring to culture wars and bringing in themes of race. So, changing leader, I'm not sure that's the solution either. Barnaby Joyce, there's whispers there's talk about Barnaby Joyce joining One Nation, becoming leader, but he's appealing to the same people. He's not going to. He's not going to talk about economics in radically different.
No, he's not going to become.
terms.
He's not going to become an economic egalitarian all of a sudden, right? It's just not going to happen. But equally, we go back to the point we've been talking about, which actually reinforces what you've just said, and that is that there is a ceiling because we are so tribal now, and there's only a certain amount of votes to be had in that right-wing ecosystem. And what we're seeing is that elasticity between the major parties. And as pollsters, the biggest challenge we have is measuring that elasticity correctly. I see a couple of pollsters who don't get this right, and they tend to overplay a certain movement over another. Getting that read properly is very, very difficult now, because you are going to get lots of data noise on the flanks of the two major parties now. How you read it can determine, whether your sample is right or wrong. And a lot of times you see the difference between the major pollsters is really their read of that other vote. They'll get the major party vote, okay, pretty similar, but it's that other vote and then what happens to that other vote. So, for example, in Victoria, that other vote right now is very left-wing. So what that tells me as a researcher is that, yep, Labor's on 32% primary vote, but geez, it's got a lot of its votes sitting on the other pile. That means they can remedy it for a proper response, policy response and a campaign. So that's the real danger for the coalition in Victoria, that when you look at that other vote, and because it's so left-wing, your opportunity for growth is very minimal. You're clearly not pinching votes off Labor because they're down at 32%.
Yeah.
And they're down at 32% because they've not bled to you, they've bled to minor parties. And that means they can bring them back, just like Paul Erickson did at the federal campaign, where Labor went from 32% nationally to that 34, 35% primary vote. That secured them that result because they treated that other vote. And I think what we're seeing here in Victoria, we're going to see in other states, very similar.
Yeah. Tom, in terms of that noise, I think you're right. It's drawn out by a couple of case studies, which I know you're keen to talk about. Law and order is one of those noise issues. And, it plays out. You have to bring nuance to analysing that. You look at Victoria, and I think your research shows millennial parents of Victoria do not respond well to punitive law and order rhetoric.
No, they do not. They think it's a problem, but doesn't mean that your response to it should be conservative if you're the Labor Party, right? And this is where I think some of them are using the playbook of 20 years ago, probably 25 years ago, or the baby boomer playbook, where they think they've got to basically get into an arms race with the coalition about who's meaner and tougher.
Yeah.
Well, if you do that, they'll pick the real thing.
Correct. I mean, I still think, for all his faults, Tony Blair put it quite well. You've got to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime.
That's the big one.
Yeah.
That's the big one, right? And particular, so when you're dealing with, that fragmenting nature that we've been talking about, that group of Australians, they might not be interested in politics, or they may be interested in politics, but what they do expect is complicated solutions to complicated problems.
Yeah, and the parallel case study, of course, is Queensland. Queensland's got a radically different political culture. It's decentralised. I don't know how many times people like you and I, Cos, have to tell people
Queensland's not the same.
Queensland is not the same, and it's not just because Queensland is a sort of, in the imagine of some progressives, all rednecks. It's decentralised. Okay. So you look at law and order in Queensland. The LNP ran hard on law and order for a long lead up to the last state election. That message landed really powerfully outside of Brisbane.
That's right.
Not so great in Brisbane. Brisbane looks a lot like,
it's increasingly looking a lot like
Sydney, like Melbourne and Sydney.
That's right. It's increasingly looking like that. If you look at the changes that are occurring in Brisbane, it's very similar. The LNP's campaign at the state election, that was a moderate, and still is to this day, a fairly moderate version of the coalition up there. They're pretty good government from a conservative side of politics. They did really well outside of Brisbane, and then struggled badly in the city of Greater Brisbane. And the poll that we published through the Courier Mail last Sunday confirms that trend, and that is Labor still at 52-48 in southeastern Queensland. That includes the Gold Coast. And then we look at the sort of more granular aspects of that data set. Its vote is really good in Brisbane, and then falls off, this is Labor's vote, falls off as we go into the Gold Coast, and also falls off by age. So that law and order campaign that they ran was really great for them in regional Queensland, outside of the big city, but just completely bombed in a metropolis like Brizzy. And I think that's the trend we're seeing across the country, where the politics of big urban centres is just so vastly different to the what may work out there in Cairns and less so Cairns actually. Cairns was pretty good for Labor, but in other sort of regional centres like Townsville.
So going forward, Cos, fragmentation is here to stay.
Yes, absolutely.
So how do the major parties respond? I mean, I think Labor is responding at present, I should say, and 2025 election bears this out. I think it understands you can't beat Netflix politics with a VHS.
No, correct.
Message.
Yeah, you can't rely on free-to-air TV advertising, for example, right? I mean, we did something rare last night in our home and turned on Channel 7 last night.
Why?
Well, that's what I asked, right? But I was more interested in the type.
You're not the boss, so
I was more interested in the ads. And what do the ads show me? So the ads now, and I haven't watched free-to-air for such a long time, the difference is now drastic. The ads were targeted to much older viewers. So products that clearly people in their 50s and 60s will be interested in, retirement package products, the sort of stuff I used to hear on 3AW, I now see on free-to-air TV because they've worked at their market. Their market is largely in their 50s and 60s and 70s. So if you're going to try to reach younger people through the traditional approaches, be it your advertising, be it even social media advertising, which doesn't work these days as much as it used to, you're going to fail. You're going to fail to reach these people. And will the Labor camp at the moment federally address some of those concerns that people now sitting in the minor parties are having with regards to the way the economy is going? We'll have to wait and see. Can that vote increase? So here's a bit of a scenario for you. We come to 2028 and the moderates within the coalition lose that struggle, and what is being offered to the electorate is a much more right-wing nationalistic offering. I can assure you that what will happen is the left-wing vote will coalesce around Labor to stop that movement. So you will find left-wing voters who, as again, they shop around, they move around.
But they'll vote strategically.
They'll vote strategically because they do. We know a lot of young voters are tactical voters. They'll move their vote to stop a right-wing version of the coalition. So the worst thing that can happen to the coalition is a much more right-wing conservative solution to it. It's not just about appealing to moderate voters. It will inflate the Labor vote because progressive voters will back the one team that they think can stop it.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that when you speak to progressive voters, they're really anxious about what's going on globally right now. They're watching carefully Trump. They're seeing reform. They're seeing the right-wing parties in Germany, and they're concerned, as progressive voters would be. They will move their vote if they think that's the only way they can stop it. So that's one scenario.
That's exactly what happened in the weekend in Wales because people voted strategically.
Yes.
Now, on this occasion, it didn't work for Labor and it lost this heartland seat. And there are huge, there's a lot of talk about if Keir Starmer adopting that strategy to have a progressive coalition.
That's right.
United.
That's how you do it.
And assuming that people will vote, that young people will vote strategically to keep out Farage. Of course, we have to keep reminding ourselves they've got a different electoral system. First past the post.
That's
right. Not compulsory. But equally, for conservatives and the centre right in this country, they also need to take lessons from that because, people will vote strategically. At the moment, Keir Starmer is under tremendous pressure on three big issues, okay? There's the small boats crisis and immigration, whether you want to call it illegal, unauthorised immigration.
Well, it's illegal.
Yeah. And even over the weekend,
it's not the immigration problem we've got.
I mean, poor old Keir. On the weekend, there was an illegal immigrant who I think he'd been convicted of sexual assault, and lo and behold, he was accidentally released into the public, and for his troubles was given 150 quid. So it was an accident.
I saw
that he was released.
Video of that, yes.
So he's under pressure there. He's under pressure, and again, this is where Australia is different. No matter what these anti-immigration rallies talk about, in the UK, the collapse of social cohesion is on a completely different scale to what we're seeing in Australia.
I think a lot of Australians do not understand just how bad it is on the street out, in places like the UK, but also many parts of Europe where the disruption is massive, and the illegal crossing of immigrants is massive, but also the poverty just outside of London. I think you and I have touched on this. I think a lot of people in this country who are interested in politics just will find it quite confronting just how widespread and ingrained poverty is in the UK.
Which is where Starmer's facing the third threat, this sort of troika, not being seen to respond to inequality, poverty outside of metropolitan London, in particular, sticking with, variants of austerity, economics, very unwise decision to freeze the winter fuel, cut back on the winter fuel rebate and not do something about that entrenched poverty outside of metropolitan
London
and the big cities.
Why do you exist as a political movement of the left if you're not actually implementing policies that address that level of inequality? It should be no shock to anyone that suddenly a whole bunch of voters have chosen to stop voting for him, right? And that's the thing. Labor in this country does a little bit better understanding that gift. When you're in government, you've got to do something with it. It's not just winning government for the sake of it. If you're from the left side of politics, you're winning contests against the system. So you better do something about it. And what's happened now is he's been elected and he's just treading water. I did an interview with Latika Burke months and months before their election. And the parallel was drawn between the Albanese first term government, where they came in with a low, the sort of small target strategy, which then left the policy cabinet pretty bare. And Stamer was emulating that approach, and whether that was going to be also a problem. And I made the point it will be, because what that country was starving for at the time was a political party that was going to embrace massive reform to address these economic issues that they're all facing. And he's been elected, and he's been basically treading water ever since.
The other big issue they haven't moved on is housing, cause, and I think
yes,
if we're to be realists, I always believe in being a hyper realist and looking for the next threat over the horizon. And I was looking at some really disturbing statistics about new housing builds over the weekend, and in some parts it's going backwards in net terms. The amount of houses
it's too expensive to build things, and at the end of the day, the private sector has to build this. The average square metre cost for an apartment in Melbourne and Sydney, I think in Melbourne it's $14,000, $15,000 per square metre. In Sydney it's about $17,000. Well, in Melbourne before the pandemic was like $8,000, right? So it's economically not sustainable for private enterprise to be building these things. And it's a wicked problem. And people think that there's a few easy solutions. You can just cut back on immigration, everything will be fine. Not really. We have a labour shortage of trades. Perhaps the one thing we could say about the failure of governments in this country is that, yes, okay, we've flipped to a skilled migration approach. Go and speak to any migrant and see how hard it is for them to transfer their existing skills to Australia. It's near impossible.
Yeah, there's a major lag effect there.
Absolutely.
But, saving grace for Labor there is the coalition really aren't active in this space. And also we had a private we were talking on the weekend. So they've really lost the mantle of superior economic managers.
Well, you would think that's what they'll focus on.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's their bread and butter.
You'd think that the first thing that they would have done at the federal election, the beginning of it, massive tax reforms for small business, which is the new working class in this country. Millions of Victorians and New South Wales residents and Queenslanders and those in Perth and Adelaide and so on work in small business. And it's an area that probably has not had any real significant policy reform in a very, very long time. Siding with small business, ganging up on corporate tax, There's a number of things that I expect them to do, and they just didn't do it.
The other area which has historically been a strength for centre-right politics is national security and the US alliance, and they seem to have thrown that away as well. You know, looking at it was quite a dramatic meeting. It was a successful meeting, punctuated by a few moments of drama between Elbow and the Donald last week in the White House, but you know, Kevin Rudd was given a clip by Trump on the way through, and the default reaction, knee-jerk reaction from Susan Ley and Ted O'Brien was to call for Rudd to go. It seemed to which is the worst thing, which is, you know, I love to talk about the analogy of the Bourbon Restoration after Napoleon. They seem to have learnt nothing from 2020. The 2025 election forgot nothing, in that the optics of calling for the Australian ambassador to go because the American president said something nasty, which was probably premeditated, was more about entertainment.
It was entertainment. He was only having a joke. It was pretty clear to anyone.
The Trump president it's a bit like a Netflix show in itself, and he's a content creator.
Yeah,
I found it quite humorous actually, but you know that kind of thing. You know, a realist centrist take on that meeting and the outcomes in terms of critical minerals, rare earths, AUKUS, would say that Albanese, working with Rudd and others, have strengthened the US alliance. And the coalition's knee-jerk response was to de facto say that they'd weakened the alliance, and Rudd was front and centre of those problems.
Yeah, the challenge they have is they are still using that playbook that was written for them by John Howard. Now, it worked for John because back then it was an electorate that was vastly different to today. It doesn't work in 2025, and more importantly, you know, we are looking at a president who's not very popular in Australia. So, any political leader in this country who finds himself at the receiving end of Trump won't necessarily lose any votes. Trump's satisfaction rating in Australia is in the negative 60s. So he's actually also deeply unpopular amongst coalition voters.
Yes, food for thought, Cosy. Lots of food for thought. We are out of time, so we'll leave our listeners to meditate on those thoughts. Thank you very much to our Curtinistas. Remember, you can check us out on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. But until next week, thank you very much, Kung Fu Cos, and we will see you next week. Arrivederci.